The RMS Titanic, probably the most famous shipwreck of all time, was a British passenger liner that was operated by the White Star Line. Built at Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast, she was deemed to be both the most luxurious ship of its time and was also deemed to be unsinkable due to having new and advanced safety measures such as watertight compartments. She began her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York City on April 10, 1912. However, 4 days into the voyage, on the evening of April 14th, she struck an iceberg about 370 miles or 600 kilometers from the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. She ultimately plunged into the Atlantic Ocean in the early morning of April 15th, leaving around 1,500 of the 2,200 passengers and crew dead, partially due to the ship not having carried enough lifeboats. It remains the deadliest peacetime sinking of an ocean liner. Following the disaster, new safety measures for ships were introduced, including the requirement to carry enough lifeboats for all on board. With the split wreck having finally been discovered in 1985, interest in the Titanic had resurged, and she has since become a cultural icon, with the ship becoming particularly well known in pop culture thanks to James Cameron's 1997 Titanic film. The ship is also the subject of a number of conspiracy theories, such as the theory that her sister ship, the Olympic, was switched with the Titanic in order to commit an insurance scam, as well as the theory that the Titanic was deliberately sunk to eliminate opposition to the creation of the US Federal Reserve Bank, as a few first-class passengers, such as John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Strauss, opposed its creation. Another likely theory is that the cause of the disaster was a fire that broke out in the coal bunkers around 10 days before the ship's departure, that continued to burn during the voyage without knowledge of anyone on board. The Britannic was the third and final ship built for the White Star Line's Olympic class, after the Olympic and the Titanic. Just like her two older sisters, she was built at Harland and Wolff and was supposed to serve as a passenger vessel with vastly improved safety features as a reaction to the sinking of the Titanic. But during her construction, World War I broke out. She was then converted into a hospital ship, at the time the largest in the world. On the morning of November 21, 1916, she sailed in the Aegean Sea in Greece near the island of Kea when she suddenly hit a mine on her starboard side that was previously planted by the German U-boat U-73 a month prior. She sank within just 55 minutes, killing 30 of the 1,066 people on board. She was the largest ship that was lost during World War I. The wreck was eventually discovered on the bottom of the Aegean Sea by famed sea explorer Jacques Cousteau in 1975. A movie based on the disaster was produced in the year 2000 that completely recontextualizes the sinking as a sabotage conducted by the German spy. Apparently it's not a very good film, but it is technically the origin of the Sleeping Sun meme, if you've ever heard of it before. The Endurance was a barquentine, a sailing vessel with 3 masts, used by Sir Ernest Shackleton and his crew of 27 men for the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition from 1914 to 1917. Their goal was to cross the Antarctic continent on foot. However, the Endurance became trapped in pack ice in the Weddell Sea, and despite efforts to free it, the ship eventually succumbed to the pressure of the ice and sank on November 21, 1915. Shackleton and his crew abandoned the ship and set up camp on the floating ice. They endured harsh conditions for several months, before eventually launching lifeboats to reach nearby Elephant Island. From there, Shackleton and a small group of remaining men embarked on a daring open boat journey to South Georgia Island seeking help. This is known in history as the Voyage of the James Caird. Remarkably, they reached their destination and eventually rescued the remaining crew members from Elephant Island in 1916. Finally, the wreck of the Endurance wasn't discovered until more than 100 years later in 2022. The Costa Concordia, probably the most famous ship disaster of the 21st century, was an Italian cruise ship owned by Costa Crociere, a subsidiary of Carnival Cruises, that was put into service in July 2006. On January 13, 2012, after leaving the port of Civitavecchia, the ship passed the island of Giglio during a procedure known as a sail-by salute, but it came so close to the shore that it ended up colliding with a rock, leaving a 53-meter-long gash on the portside hull and causing the ship to list on its starboard side. Because the ship started drifting back to shore, it ended up not sinking completely. But regardless, the disaster caused the death of 32 people. The most infamous part of the disaster is the sheer negligence of its captain, Francesco Schettino, who abandoned the ship with passengers still on board and was eventually sentenced to 16 years in prison for manslaughter, causing a shipwreck, and abandoning his ship and its passengers. In 2014, 2 years after the accident, the wreck was salvaged and towed to the port of Genoa, where she was in the process of being scrapped until 2017. The total cost of the salvage was around 1.5 billion euros. The RMS Lusitania was a British ocean liner that was launched in 1906. Owned by the Cunard Line, the Lusitania, along with its sister ship, the RMS Mauretania, was known for its elegant design, impressive speed, and luxurious interior, making it a popular choice for passengers traveling between the United States and Europe. Due to its then impressive speed of 24 knots, in 1908 it held the Blue Riband, an accolade given to the liner with the fastest speed during an Atlantic crossing. However, on May 7, 1915, a year into World War I and during her 202nd transatlantic voyage from New York City to Liverpool, the Lusitania was torpedoed and sunk by the German U-boat U-20 off the coast of Ireland. The attack resulted in the loss of nearly 1,200 lives, including civilians, and famously played a role in intensifying anti-German sentiments and influencing the United States' decision to enter the war 2 years later. The wreck of the Lusitania was eventually discovered in 1935, though partially collapsed and on the verge of collapsing entirely. The Halifax explosion was an event caused by the collision of two ships, the French cargo ship SS Mont Blanc and the Norwegian vessel SS Imo, in the harbor of Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, on December 6, 1917 at 9:04 a.m. The Mont Blanc carried high explosives and caught fire due to the collision, causing an enormous blast that devastated the Richmond district of Halifax and the neighboring city of Dartmouth, killing 1,782 people, injuring around 9,000 people, causing the destruction of almost all structures within an 800-meter or half-mile radius, and also causing a tsunami that washed the Imo ashore, while fragments of the Mont Blanc were scattered for kilometers. Relief and recovery efforts came from across Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, as well as the northeastern United States, but were severely disrupted by blizzards. A judicial inquiry later found both vessels to blame for the disaster. It was the largest man-made explosion of its time. The MS Estonia was a cruise ferry originally built in 1980 at the Meyerwerft shipyard in Papenburg, Germany, for the Finnish ferry company Viking Line, where she was known as the Viking Sally. It then switched owners several times before being sold to Estline, a Swedish-Estonian joint venture, in 1993. Now named the Estonia, she symbolized the independence that the ship's namesake country gained from the now-defunct Soviet Union, as she was the largest Estonian-owned ship at the time. On the evening of September 27, 1994, the ship left the port of Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, for another regularly scheduled voyage to Stockholm, Sweden. However, the ship sailed into a heavy storm and sank between 0:50 a.m. and 1:50 a.m. on September 28th, taking the lives of 852 of the almost 1,000 people aboard. Now here's the tricky part. It is heavily disputed what caused the ship to sink. The official report issued by the governments of Sweden, Finland, and Estonia concluded that the ship's bow visor, which held a ramp used to load cars into the ship's car deck, broke off due to the strength of the waves that night, with poor maintenance having caused the visor's locks to be severely weakened. This would have led to the car deck flooding and causing the ship to capsize, as car ferries like the Estonia are vulnerable to the so-called free surface effect, due to their wide and open vehicle decks. This conclusion came about due to the bow visor having been found completely detached from the ship shortly after the sinking. However, just like the Titanic, the Estonia is also subject to multiple conspiracy theories. One such theory claims that the ship was deliberately sunk with explosives, and that former Soviet military equipment was being supposedly transported on the ship. Another theory claims that the ship sank after colliding with a submarine, but there's little to no evidence backing this theory up. A recent investigation from 2020 found a 4-meter hole in the ship's hull, leading to a renewed speculation that an explosion did in fact occur. In 2023, the Swedish Accident Investigation Authority released a report stating that there was no indication of a collision with a vessel or a floating object, neither was there indication of an explosion in the bow area. Make of that as you will. Despite remaining one of the most elusive ship disasters of the modern era, as well as one of the deadliest, the sinking did positively impact ferry safety regulations moving forward. Commissioned by the Nazi German Navy and completed in 1940, the Bismarck and her sister ship, the Tirpitz, were the largest and most powerful battleships ever built by Germany. It played a prominent role in the early stages of World War II, particularly during the Battle of the Denmark Strait in May 1941, during which she sank the British battleship HMS Hood. However, after the battle, British naval forces, including the battleship HMS Prince of Wales, relentlessly pursued the Bismarck. The ship suffered damage, including a critical hit to its rudder, which impaired its ability to navigate. In a subsequent final battle, around 560 kilometers or 350 miles west of the city of Brest, France, British forces managed to successfully cripple the Bismarck, leading to it being abandoned and deliberately sunk on May 27, 1941, leaving only 114 of the 2,200 total crewmen alive. The wreck of the Bismarck was eventually discovered in 1989 by Robert Ballard, the same man who discovered the Titanic 4 years prior. The USS Indianapolis was a heavy cruiser, a type of warship of the United States Navy. Launched in 1931, she was heavily utilized in several battles and missions during World War II, including a top-secret mission to carry uranium and other components for Little Boy, the first nuclear weapon ever used in combat, to the Tinian Naval Base. On July 30th, 1945, the Indianapolis, during a journey to the Philippines, was torpedoed by the Imperial Japanese submarine I-58 and sank in just 12 minutes. Of the 1,195 crewmen aboard, 300 went down with the ship, while the remaining 890 were left stranded in the ocean, suffering from hypothermia, dehydration, saltwater poisoning, and even shark attacks. The Navy only learned of the sinking 4 days later, and eventually only 316 people were rescued, making it the greatest loss of life at sea from a single ship in US Navy history. The wreck was eventually discovered in August 2017 by a search team financed by Paul Allen, co-founder of Microsoft. The Spanish Armada, also known as the Invincible Armada or the Enterprise of England, was a Spanish fleet commanded by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, an appointed aristocrat without any naval experience. Beginning its journey in Lisbon in 1588, it was headed for the English Channel to join up with the Duke of Parma in Flanders and start an invasion against England to overthrow Queen Elizabeth I, bring back Catholicism in England, end support for the Dutch Republic, and prevent attacks by English and Dutch privateers against Spanish colonies in America. However, the English started a massive counterattack against the Spanish and began outnumbering them in ships and men, causing them to suffer major losses and lose a total of 44 ships before eventually giving up and returning to Spain. It is suspected that both bad weather conditions and the better planned out battle tactics by the English caused the failure of the Spanish Armada. The Spanish tried again 3 times, in 1596, 1597 and 1601, but all 3 ended yet again in failure. Pearl Harbor is a naval military base located on the island of Oahu, west of Honolulu in the US state of Hawaii. it famously fell victim to a surprise military attack by the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service on December 7, 1941, where 353 aircraft caused the destruction of 8 battleships, with 4 being sunk and all except 1 later raised, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, 1 anti-aircraft training ship, 1 mine layer, and 180 aircraft, while killing 2,403 people and wounding 1,178 people. The attack led both the British Empire and the United States, a then neutral country, to declare war against Japan the following day. 3 days later, Germany and Italy, Japan's strongest allies, declared war against the US, leading to a counter-declaration which finally led the US to enter World War II. The most famous shipwreck associated with the attack is the USS Arizona, the one ship that was not raised. It instead lies partially collapsed on the low-lying seabed and has since become a popular tourist attraction. The MV Derbyshire was a British oil carrier built in 1976 at the Swan Hunter shipyard and owned by Bibby Line. Just like her sister ship, the Kowloon Bridge, she was a massive ship, as she weighed over 90,000 gross registered tons. On July 11, 1980, the Derbyshire left the port of Sept-Îles, Quebec, Canada, for Kawasaki, Japan, while carrying over 150,000 tons of iron ore. On September 9th, however, she ended up in a massive typhoon, became overwhelmed by the towering waves, and sank beneath the Pacific Ocean south of Japan, killing everyone on board without ever sending out a distress signal. After initial failure in finding the ship, she was deemed lost, becoming the largest British ship to get lost at sea. After her sister ship, the Kowloon Bridge, also sank in 1986, a new investigation was launched, which eventually resulted in the discovery of the wreck in 1994. It was ultimately determined that the sinking took place over a few days and was the result of structural failure caused by crashing waves, shearing off small ventilation pipes near the bow, allowing water to enter the front of the ship over the next 2 days. Eventually, the hatch covers of the cargo holds started collapsing, causing even more water to enter the ship. Finally, increasing water pressure caused the ship to be completely torn apart by an implosion and sink beneath the waves. A 2001 report by Douglas Faulkner, a professor of marine architecture and ocean engineering at the University of Glasgow, concluded that the Derbyshire was destroyed by a rogue wave, which is a topic that we'll return to in just a bit. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald, nicknamed the Fitz, was an American freighter built in 1958 that sailed across the Great Lakes, carrying iron ore. She became a spectacle for boat watchers due to her size, her record-breaking performance, and the captain's tendency of playing music over the ship's intercom system. On November 9, 1975, after having left the port of Superior, Michigan, en route to Detroit, she ended up getting caught in a severe storm with hurricane-like winds in the middle of Lake Superior, and suddenly sank at 7:10 p.m. in the Canadian waters the next day, taking the lives of all 29 crewmen. The exact cause of the sinking remains unknown, with there being several theories ranging from her having been overwhelmed by a rogue wave, to the sinking being caused by ineffective cargo hatches, to her having suffered structural failure. Nevertheless, the wreck was eventually found broken in 2 pieces only days following the sinking. The ship was also the subject of a 1976 hit song by singer Gordon Lightfoot called "The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald." Rogue waves, something I mentioned in the previous 2 entries, is a phenomenon referring to unusually large, sudden waves that can be extremely dangerous to both ships and isolated structures such as lighthouses. Most likely caused by high winds and strong currents merging waves together, they were once considered mythical without any evidence pointing to their existence, but eyewitness accounts and damage found on ships have led experts to conclude that they are in fact real. Unlike tsunamis, rogue waves are not caused by land or tectonic movement, last briefly, and occur in a concise location far out at sea. They have also been put to blame for sinking several vessels, such as the aforementioned MV Derbyshire, as well as the MS München, a German freighter that was lost in 1978 during a severe storm in the Atlantic. I previously mentioned this one before, but anyway, the HMS Hood was a battlecruiser of the British Royal Navy that was put into service in 1920 and held the title of World's Largest Warship for 20 years, with her prestige earning her the nickname the Mighty Hood. During the Battle of the Denmark Strait on May 24, 1941, she was hit by the aforementioned German warship Bismarck's shells, exploded, and sank, leaving all but 3 of her 1,418 crewmen dead, thus leaving an impact on British morale during World War II. It was later determined that her quick demise was caused by the explosion of her aft magazine, though it is also speculated that one of the ship's torpedoes actually caused the explosion. The wreck's discovery in 2001 seemed to have confirmed both conclusions, although the exact reason still remains unknown. The MV Sewol, originally known as the ferry Naminoe, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, was a car ferry originally built in 1994 and operated in Japan by Oshima Unyu until 2007, and then by A-Line Ferry Company until 2012, when the ship was sold to the South Korean Chonghae-jin Marine Company and renamed Sewol, now operating between Incheon and Jeju Island. On the evening of April 15, 2014, the ship left Incheon for a usual routine trip to Jeju. Of the 476 people aboard, 325 were students from Danwon High School in Ansan. However, the following morning, the ship capsized and sank off the coast of the South Korean South Jeolla province, killing 304 people, 250 of whom were Danwon students. Probably the most heartbreaking part of this story is that the recovered phones of some of the perished students contained videos shot inside the ship as it was sinking. The sinking of the Sewol caused widespread shock and outrage across the country, with many people harshly criticizing the actions of the crew, Chonghae-jin, the ship's owners, the national government for their attempts at downplaying the disaster, and the Korean Coast Guard for their seeming passivity during and poor handling of rescue efforts. In May, the captain, Lee Jun-seok, who, just like Schettino, abandoned the ship with passengers still aboard, was charged with murder along with 3 crewmen, while other crew members were indicted. An arrest warrant was eventually issued for the owner of Chonghae-jin Marine, but despite a nationwide manhunt, he was never found, though he was later found dead in July. Investigations later revealed that the Korean Register of Shipping's licensing, which allowed the ship to begin operations in 2013, was actually based on falsified documents, and that the ship was carrying twice as much cargo as the legal limit, which contributed to theories claiming that the ship sank either due to overloading and improperly secured cargo, or due to a series of unreasonably sudden turns to the starboard side that caused the ship's cargo to shift to the port side. Other theories claim that the ship either suffered an explosion, collided with the reef, or even collided with a submarine. As of 2022, an official reason for the sinking has yet to be given. Finally, though, in 2017, the wreck of the Sewol was raised and salvaged. Queen Anne's Revenge, originally known as La Concorde, was a French privateer ship that was famously captured by pirates near the island of St. Vincent in 1717, one of whom being the infamous Edward Teach, also known as Blackbeard, one of the most famous pirates in history. The ship, after being renamed to Queen Anne's Revenge, became his flagship and started attacking British, Dutch, and Portuguese merchant ships while en route from the west coast of Africa to the Caribbean. After having blockaded the harbor of Charleston, North Carolina in May 1718 and refusing to accept a king's pardon, Blackbeard ran his flagship aground in Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina on June 10, 1718 and escaped on another ship named the Adventure. It is widely speculated that he deliberately abandoned the ship as an excuse to disband his crew. Blackbeard, after eventually accepting the king's pardon, returned to piracy and was killed in combat in November 1718. The wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge was eventually found in 1996 and was subsequently excavated in the following years. The ship was then added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2004. So the Erebus and Terror Gulf is a gulf near the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, and it was named after two bomb vessels used by an explorer named Sir James Clark Ross in his Antarctic explorations of 1842 to 1843, named the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terra respectively. And during every one of his expeditions, he was always accompanied by these two ships in particular. In 1845, these two ships, now outfitted with steam engines, embarked on a voyage to the Canadian Arctic, this time under the command of Sir John Franklin, in order to complete an entire crossing of the Northwest Passage. However, the two ships completely disappeared, setting off a massive search effort. It was later found that both ships had become stuck in the ice and were thus left abandoned. All 130 men aboard both ships died from either hypothermia, scurvy, or starvation. There were even reports of some crew members resorting to cannibalism. It wasn't until 2014 and 2016 when the remains of the Erebus and the Terra were found and eventually designated as National Historic Sites of Canada. Over the hundreds of thousands of years that mankind has been crossing the ocean, there have been many instances of ships being sunk by collisions with icebergs. The most famous case was of course the sinking of the Titanic, but another lesser-known case of specifically a passenger vessel being sunk by an iceberg was the MV Explorer, a cruise ship built in 1969 that became the world's first cruise ship to sail in the Antarctic Ocean. This was where she would eventually meet her fate, as on November 23, 2007, she was abandoned and then sank after colliding with an iceberg near the South Shetland Islands, though miraculously, all passengers and crew were rescued. And finally for this layer we have the SS Andrea Doria. Built in 1953 for the Italia line, she was the largest, fastest, and supposedly safest Italian ship ever built, thus becoming a symbol of pride for the country. However, on July 25, 1956, during a voyage to New York City, the ship got lost in fog off the coast of Nantucket, Massachusetts, and was suddenly rammed by the Swedish passenger ship Stockholm on her starboard side. Despite a severe list on one side preventing half of all lifeboats from being usable, she stayed afloat for 11 hours after the collision. A disaster similar to that of the Titanic was able to be prevented due to the crew's competent behavior and the quick response from other ships in the area. Although 1,660 passengers and crew were rescued, 46 people died directly due to the collision. The following morning, the ship capsized and finally sank beneath the waves. Eventually, a lot of media interest was built around the Andrea Doria, largely due to lawsuits between the owners of both ships that resulted in an out-of-court settlement agreement. This agreement is also why no determination of cause was ever actually released. The wreck was located only a week after the sinking and quickly became a popular destination for treasure divers and scuba divers, though in the years since then, the wreck has deteriorated quite a lot due to the rough currents of the North Atlantic. It has also been given the nickname the Mount Everest of scuba diving due to the number of people who have died while exploring the wreck. Finally, here's a fun fact. The ship that rammed the Andrea Doria, the Stockholm, built in 1948, is still in service today as the MV Astoria, making it one of the oldest passenger ships still in use today. The SS El Faro was a US-flagged cargo ship built in 1975 that carried a mix of containers and trailerized cargo. On September 29, 2015, she left the port of Jacksonville, Florida for San Juan, Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, it sailed right into the eyewall of Hurricane Joaquin, with winds reaching up to 140 miles per hour and waves over 50 feet high. And by October 1st, the ship and its 33 crew members were lost. The US Coast Guard started an extensive search operation, though all they managed to recover was some debris and a damaged lifeboat, and she was subsequently declared sunk, thus calling off the search. By the end of October, the wreck of the El Faro was discovered in one piece at a depth of 15,000 feet.
In their final report, the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, concluded that the sinking was caused by the captain's decision to sail right into the hurricane, despite the crew's objections. Other contributing factors included outdated weather information, mechanical issues, and delayed communications. The SS Eastland was a passenger steamer launched in 1903 that was used for tours around the city of Chicago, Illinois. On July 24, 1915, the ship, while tied to a dock in the Chicago River, was preparing to depart for a company picnic organized by Western Electric. Around 2,500 passengers boarded the ship, many of whom happened to be standing on the open upper decks, when suddenly she rolled onto her port side and became half submerged in the river. It resulted in one of the deadliest maritime disasters in US history, as a total of 844 people lost their lives, with many having become trapped below deck after the list. It was eventually determined that the disaster was caused by the ship's faulty, top-heavy construction, which was only made worse with the addition of new lifeboats in compliance with the Seamen's Act of 1915, a law that was designed to improve safety on ships as a reaction to the sinking of the Titanic 3 years earlier. Following the disaster, the Eastland was raised, recommissioned as the USS Wilmette, and operated during the 2 World Wars as both a gunboat and a training ship until she was scrapped in 1947. During the latter half of the 13th century, naval forces assembled by the Mongol Empire under the rule of Kublai Khan attempted to conquer the Japanese archipelago in an effort to expand their empire. Their first try came in 1274 when they tried crossing the Korea Strait with a fleet of 900 ships and planned to start their invasion from the island of Kyushu. However, their efforts were in vain, as they were not only met with fierce resistance from the Japanese, but also suffered massive casualties as a result of typhoons, which were famously referred to as kamikaze or divine winds. The Mongols then tried again 7 years later in 1281, this time with a much larger fleet of approximately 3,500 ships crossing the East China Sea to reach Kyushu, and yet again they were completely overpowered by typhoons. After having tried 2 times in a row to conquer Japan and failing miserably both times, the Mongols ultimately decided to leave the Japanese islands alone, which is why Japan, unlike most of East Asia, barely received any Mongol influence whatsoever, and thus managed to preserve itself a lot more. The SS Cedarville was an American bulk carrier launched in 1927 that carried limestone across the Great Lakes. In the early morning of May 7, 1965, during a voyage from Rogers City, Michigan to Gary, Indiana, she was sailing through the Straits of Mackinac in heavy fog when she suddenly collided with the Norwegian vessel Toppdalsfjord as a result of miscommunication between the 2 ships. Despite the cruiser's attempts to beach the Cedarville, she ultimately capsized and sank, resulting in the deaths of 10 crew members, while the remaining 25 were picked up by the German freighter MV Weissenburg. Investigations later revealed that the Cedarville's captain, Martin Joppich, was to blame for the sinking due to his poor decision-making and delayed evacuation order. He was charged with 4 counts of faulty seamanship, pledged guilty in August 1965, and got his license suspended for a year. He later died in 1993 at the age of 82. The Cedarville is the 4th largest ship lost on the Great Lakes after the Edmund Fitzgerald, which I mentioned in Tier 1, the Daniel J. Morrell, and the Carl D. Bradley. The latter 2 we'll be talking about next. The SS Carl D. Bradley was a self-unloading Great Lakes freighter built in 1927 that held the title of Queen of the Lakes for 22 years as the largest freighter on the Great Lakes. She sank on November 18, 1958, during a severe storm on Lake Michigan. The ship was en route to its winter port of Rogers City, Michigan, carrying a load of stone, when it encountered gale-force winds and towering waves, causing the vessel to break in two and sink. Of the 35 crew members aboard, only 2 survived. 23 of the victims were from Rogers City, the ship's original destination, which deeply affected the town and its community. Furthermore, the bodies of 15 victims remain missing to this day. The following investigation by the US Coast Guard revealed that the ship sank due to hogging caused by the ship's age. Hogging refers to the stress a ship's hull experiences that causes the center of the ship to bend upward or downward. This bend is ultimately what led the ship to split in two. The wreck was eventually discovered a year after the sinking at a max depth of 380 feet or 116 meters. The SS Daniel J. Morrell, the last of the 3 Great Lakes ships on this tier, was yet another Great Lakes freighter, launched in 1906. On November 29, 1966, the 60-year-old ship, which was en route to Taconite Harbor, Minnesota, while carrying iron ore, was caught in a powerful storm on Lake Huron and, just like the Carl D. Bradley and many other Great Lakes ships before her, split in two and sank, killing all but 1 of her 29 crewmen. The lone survivor was 26-year-old Dennis Hale, who endured nearly 40 hours in frigid waters before being rescued. He later died of cancer in 2015, aged 75. The subsequent Coast Guard investigation concluded that she sank due to the age of the ship's hull, which was a common problem for Great Lakes ships built before 1948. I believe this entry is specifically referring to the HMS Victory built in 1737, as there are a lot of ships throughout history that were named HMS Victory. This was a British Royal Navy warship, a so-called first-rate ship of the line that carried over 100 guns. On October 4th, 1744, while returning to England, she and her 1,150 sailors, including Admiral Sir John Balchan, were lost in a storm near the Channel Islands. Following this, frigates were sent to search for the Victory, which led to them discovering that wreckage of the ship had washed up on the shores of the islands of Guernsey, Jersey, and Alderney. For over 260 years, it was widely believed that the ship was wrecked near the Cascades, a group of rocks northwest of Alderney, and that the ship carried loads of gold and silver, which, if salvaged today, could be worth hundreds of millions of pounds. In 2008, the Tampa-based company Odyssey Marine Exploration discovered the wreck more than 80 kilometers away from the Cascades, meaning it did not actually sink near them, contrary to what was widely believed for the past 260 years. In March 2009, the TV show Treasure Quest aired an episode that featured footage of their initial discovery of the wreck and the recovery of 2 of its bronze cannons. The Empress of Ireland was a British-built Canadian ocean liner owned by the Canadian Pacific Railway that was launched in 1906 and operated between Quebec City, Canada and Liverpool, England. She tragically sank on May 29, 1914 during her 96th voyage starting from Quebec City, after the Norwegian coal ship Storstad, which sighted the ship just moments before, struck the Empress on her starboard side in dense fog in the St. Lawrence River. Within just 14 minutes, the ship capsized on her starboard side and sank, while the Storstad received some damage to its bow but remained afloat and managed to rescue survivors, one of whom being the Empress's captain, Henry Kendall, who confronted the Storstad's captain, Thomas Anderson, and told him, quote, "You have just sunk my ship." Of the 1,477 people aboard, 1,012 went down with the ship, making it the worst peacetime maritime disaster in Canadian history. The Commission of Inquiry, held in Quebec a month later, received two very different accounts of the collision from the two ships' respective crews, who made each other responsible for the sinking. After 11 days, the commission came to no other conclusion than that the Storstadt was responsible for the collision due to her change in course to starboard. Despite this, Captain Anderson still denied responsibility and would later file an unsuccessful lawsuit against Canadian Pacific Rail. Shortly after the disaster, mail and bodies were recovered from the wreck, which lies at a shallow depth of 130 feet or 40 meters. The wreck was later revisited by divers in the 1960s and 1970s, and by 1999, it was declared a site of historical and archaeological importance and was listed in the Register of Historic Sites of Canada. The MV Doña Paz was a Japanese-built, Philippine-registered passenger ferry launched in 1963 as the Himeyuri Maru before she was sold in 1975 to Sulpicio Lines and renamed Don Sulpicio before being renamed again 4 years later to Doña Paz. On the morning of December 20th, 1987, the ship, while carrying over 4,000 people, which far exceeded its official capacity, left the port of Tacloban on Leyte Island for Manila, the capital of the Philippines. During the late evening, however, as the ship was crossing the Tablas Strait, she suddenly collided with the empty Vector, an oil tanker that carried highly flammable gasoline and other petroleum products, which ignited upon impact, causing a massive fire that quickly engulfed both vessels and the surrounding waters, which also happened to be infested with sharks. Panic erupted on the Doña Paz, as there were no life jackets available, while none of the crew gave any orders whatsoever, thus forcing passengers to jump into the flaming, shark-infested waters. The Doña Paz sank after 2 hours, while the Vector sank within 4 hours. Tragically, only 24 people, with most of whom having sustained major burns, survived, making it the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history, with over 4,300 people having lost their lives. Investigations later revealed that, at the time of the accident, only one apprentice member of the Doña Paz's crew was present on the ship's bridge, while the others, including the captain, were busy drinking beer, watching TV, and partying. Despite this, official blame was put on the Vector, which was found to be unseaworthy and to be operating without a license. The wrecks of both the Doña Paz and the Vector were discovered upright and in good condition in April 2019, lying at a depth of 500 meters or 1,600 feet. The Essex was an American whale ship originating from the island of Nantucket, Massachusetts, that was launched in 1799. On November 20th, 1820, while sailing through the southern Pacific Ocean, about 2,000 nautical miles from the coast of South America, the ship was attacked and subsequently sunk by a sperm whale. The 20 surviving crew members ended up being left stranded in small whaleboats with what food and water they could salvage from the ship. After spending a month all alone at sea, the crew landed on the uninhabited Henderson Island. 3 men stayed on the island and were later rescued in April 1821, while the remaining 17 continued their journey to South America. Over the course of the next 3 months, they faced starvation, dehydration, and exposure, all in the middle of the ocean. In a desperate bid for survival, some even ended up resorting to cannibalism. By the time they were rescued in February 1821, only 8 men survived, including the 3 men left on Henderson Island. 2 of the survivors, first mate Owen Chase and cabin boy Thomas Nickerson, later wrote their accounts of the harrowing ordeal down. The event later inspired famed author Herman Melville to write his most famous novel, Moby Dick, which was released in 1851. As of 2024, the wreck of the Essex has yet to be found. On the morning of April 16, 1947, in the port of Texas City, Texas, a fire broke out aboard the French-registered ship SS Grand Camp, which was carrying approximately 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate, a highly explosive chemical used in fertilizers that was intended for export to farmers in Europe. Despite efforts by the Texas City Volunteer Fire Department to extinguish the fire, at 9:12 a.m., the cargo suddenly exploded, causing utter destruction within a radius of 2,000 feet, as well as a shock wave that was felt over 100 miles away and a 15-foot or 4.6 meter tall tsunami. The blast also triggered fires and additional explosions in nearby ships and industrial chemical facilities, including a nearby ship named the SS Highflyer that was also carrying ammonium nitrate and subsequently exploded as well at 1:10 a.m. the following day. In the end, the disaster caused the deaths of 581 people, including all but one member of the volunteer fire department, injuries in around 5,000 people, and around $100 million in property damage, which would be equivalent to around $1 billion today. The cause of the fire on the Grand Camp was never able to be determined, though it was speculated that it may have been started by a discarded cigarette, and that it only managed to spread as much as it did due to human error. Finally, the disaster also caused the first class action lawsuit against the US government to be filed on behalf of 8,485 plaintiffs who sought compensation, which eventually led to the government being found responsible for negligence in the manufacture, packaging, and labeling of ammonium nitrate. The Sultana was a commercial side-wheel steamboat built in 1863 in Cincinnati, Ohio, for service on the mighty Mississippi River. The ship began its final voyage from St. Louis, Missouri to New Orleans, Louisiana on April 13, 1865, a month before the end of the American Civil War. 2 days later, she was tied up in Cairo, Illinois, when word reached the city that US President Abraham Lincoln had been shot, which subsequently led the ship to start spreading the news during the remainder of the voyage into the South, as well as take on around 2,000 Union soldiers recently released from Confederate prison camps, despite the ship having a legal capacity of only 376 people. On April 27th, at 2 a.m., while she was about 7 miles or 11 kilometers north of Memphis, Tennessee, the overloaded ship's boilers violently exploded, killing many people instantly and throwing other people into the waters. The resulting fire led its decks to start collapsing due to the ship having been built out of wood. The burning Sultana eventually drifted to the west bank of the river and sank at 7 a.m., taking the lives of an estimated 1,167 people, thus making it the deadliest maritime disaster in US history. The official causes of the disaster were later determined to be both the mismanagement of water levels in the boilers and the ship having become very top-heavy due to it having carried way more people than it was built for. Although, many people later came out claiming that the ship was actually sabotaged, despite there not being a lot of evidence to prove these points. Despite the severity of the disaster, no one was ever formally held accountable. Finally, in 1982, an archaeological expedition uncovered what was believed to be the wreckage of the Sultana. The Yamato was a Japanese battleship that was renowned as the largest and most heavily armed battleship ever built. Commissioned in 1941 during World War II, it was the flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Yamato boasted an extraordinary size, with a displacement of over 70,000 tons and 9 18.1-inch guns, making it the largest naval artillery ever mounted on a warship. though, despite its intimidating design, the Yamato barely saw any use during the war, as Japan's naval strategy started shifting towards air power. In April of 1945, the Yamato embarked on a suicide attack mission known as Operation Tengo in an attempt to defend the Okinawa Islands from American forces, during what is now known as the Battle of Okinawa. However, she ended up being outnumbered and attacked by American aircraft, as she was without air cover. Then, after having become overwhelmed by bombs and torpedoes, the Yamato, along with 5 other Japanese warships, capsized, exploded, and sank on April 7th. Between 3,700 and 4,250 Japanese naval personnel were killed during the battle. Tengo ended up being Japan's last naval operation before the country surrendered on September 2nd, 1945, thus ending World War II. The Mary Celeste was an American merchant brigantine launched in Nova Scotia, Canada in 1861 under the name Amazon. On November 7, 1872, she left New York City for a voyage to Genoa, Italy, while carrying 1,701 barrels of alcohol. However, 1 month later, on December 4th, the Canadian ship De Gracia discovered the Mary Celeste adrift and abandoned in the Atlantic Ocean off the Azorian Islands. The vessel itself was in good, seaworthy condition with its cargo intact, but the crew, including the captain, his family, and 7 sailors, were completely missing and never found. The ship's last log entry was dated 10 days earlier, and no signs of struggle or foul play were ever found. During the subsequent salvage hearings held in Gibraltar, multiple possible reasons for abandonment were considered, including mutiny by the Mary Celeste's crew, piracy by the De Gracia's crew, and conspiracy to carry out insurance or salvage fraud, but there was no evidence to support any of these claims, thus leaving the case unsolved. Since then, further theories have proposed that the effects of alcohol fumes on the crew, submarine earthquakes, water spouts, an attack by a giant squid, and even paranormal events caused the ship's abandonment, but once again, none of these were ever able to be proven. After her discovery, she continued in service under new owners until 1885, when she was deliberately wrecked off the coast of Haiti as part of an attempted insurance fraud. In August 2001, some of the ship's remains were supposedly discovered, though experts later concluded that they were just the remains of trees and not the Mary Celeste. The MV Wilhelm Gustloff was a German cruise ship that was originally built in 1937 as part of the Nazi German government's Kraft durch Freude, or Strength Through Joy, leisure organization. However, only 2 years after her construction, she was recommissioned by the Kriegsmarine and served as a hospital ship, and later, as part of Operation Hannibal, as a floating barracks to carry evacuated civilians from East Prussia and the German-occupied Baltic states as the Soviet Red Army advanced from the east. On January 30th, 1945, the ship left the port of Gotenhafen, nowadays known as Gdynia in Poland, while carrying around 10,000 people, most of whom being civilians, which caused the ship to be severely overcrowded, as the ship was designed to carry only around 2,000 people. Later that night, she was spotted by the Soviet submarine S-13 and subsequently torpedoed 3 times on her port side, causing her to capsize and sink in the icy waters of the Baltic Sea in 50 minutes. Based on estimates, over 9,600 people ended up losing their lives, thus making the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff the worst disaster involving a single ship in maritime history. The wreck is located at a depth of 42 meters or 138 feet in Polish waters and is now designated as a war grave. Because it has attracted a lot of attention from treasure hunters searching for the lost Amber Room, the Polish Maritime Office has forbidden diving within a 500 meter or 1,600 foot radius of the wreck. Here we are at the final entry of the second layer. The SS Central America, nicknamed the Ship of Gold, was an American sidereal steamship launched in 1852, originally under the name SS George Law, that operated between Central America and the US East Coast during the 1850s. On September 9, 1857, during a voyage from Colon, Panama to New York City, the ship, while carrying 578 passengers and crew and 30,000 pounds of gold from the California Gold Rush, was caught up in a Category 2 hurricane off the coast of North Carolina and sank 3 days later, taking the lives of 425 people. The loss of its massive cargo of gold ended up contributing to a financial crisis known as the Panic of 1857, as the gold the ship was carrying was intended for banks and investors. It was later determined that the ship sank due to engine failure and that the crew desperately tried to fix the engines and keep her afloat during the calm of the hurricane, but to no avail. Finally, in 1988, the wreck was discovered by a search team led by treasure hunter Tommy Gregory Thompson, who recovered significant amounts of gold and artifacts that were valued at around $100 to $150 million, though he ended up getting sued by 39 insurance companies that claimed that they had the right to it due to having paid damages in the 19th century for the lost gold. After a legal battle, 92% of the gold was awarded to Thompson and his team, though he would end up getting into more legal battles throughout the 2000s and 2010s. The SS John Burke was an American Liberty ship, a type of cargo vessel built during World War II to support Allied supply efforts and to transport war materials such as ammunition. Built in 1942, the ship was constructed in just 33 days as part of a mass production program aimed at quickly replacing ships lost to enemy action in the Pacific. On the morning of December 28, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte in the Philippines, the ship, which sailed as part of a 100-ship convoy, was suddenly hit by a Japanese A6M0 type kamikaze plane. Within just a few seconds, the impact caused a massive explosion that, due to the ship's ammunition cargo, instantly destroyed the entire ship and killed all 68 crew members aboard. After the smoke of the following battle cleared, nearby ships began searching for survivors, but none were ever able to be found. Today, the remaining fragments of the John Burke lie at about 1,500 feet or 457 meters below sea level near Dapitan City, Philippines. The SS Baichimo was a steel-hulled cargo steamship built in 1914 in Sweden and owned by the Hudson's Bay Company that was used to transport furs and supplies between northern Canada and Europe. On October 1, 1931, while on a voyage off the coast of Alaska, the Baichimo became trapped in pack ice. The crew briefly abandoned the ship and took shelter in the town of Barrow for 2 days until the ship became free again. 5 days later, it became stuck again, and by October 15th, the Hudson's Bay Company sent out aircraft to retrieve 22 crew members, while the remaining 15 stayed behind to wait out the winter. Then, on November 24th, a powerful blizzard struck the area. The Baichimo was initially nowhere to be found, with the crew members concluding that it must have sunk in the storm, but they eventually did manage to find the ship again. They were then rescued by air while carrying the most valuable fur they managed to retrieve, thus abandoning the ship. Since then, the ship had been sighted numerous times, thus creating a ghost ship legend. There were also several attempts to both board and salvage the ship, but to no avail. Her last known sighting was in 1969, 38 years after her abandonment. Baichimo's ultimate fate is therefore unknown, and she is presumed sunk. Roll-on, roll-off ships, often abbreviated to ro-ro ships, are a type of ship designed to carry vehicles such as cars, trucks, buses, and trains that are driven on and off the ship through ramps and doors built into the ship's hull, such as around the bow or the stern. Because ro-ro ships have these ramps and doors commonly built close to the waterline, in addition to having open vehicle decks without many internal bulkheads, they are considered a high-risk design, to the point that the ro-ro abbreviation is often derisively referred to as roll-on, roll-over. Thus, there have been many incidents of ro-ro ships capsizing and sinking due to improperly secured doors causing water to enter the car deck, such as the MS Estonia, which I mentioned back in Tier 1. Another famous case of a ro-ro ferry capsizing is the Herald of Free Enterprise, a ship built in 1979 and owned by the now-defunct Townsend Thoresen, which capsized on March 6, 1987, after leaving the port of Zeebrugge, Belgium, with her bow doors having been mistakenly and negligently left wide open, thus allowing water to enter the ship and causing her to capsize within minutes in shallow water, killing 193 passengers and crew. The SS Mataafa was an American steamship built in 1899 that transported iron ore, coal, and other bulk cargo across the Great Lakes. During her early career, she got into several small accidents, such as striking a rock in the Straits of Mackinac, arriving in Chicago with a leak, and running aground near the Sewell Locks. On November 27, 1905, while attempting to enter the port of Duluth, Minnesota, she was struck by a deadly storm, the Mataafa storm, which was named after the ship. She encountered fierce winds and high waves, causing her to run aground near the south pier of the Duluth Ship Canal. The vessel split in two, with its stern section stranded on a reef and its bow remaining afloat. Although 15 crew members were able to take refuge in the forward section of the ship, the remaining 12 people in the stern faced harsh and severe conditions, with 9 of them later dying due to exposure. After the accident, the Mataafa was repaired and returned to service, but still remained accident-prone. In 1908, she collided and sank the SS Sacramento in the harbor of Duluth, and in 1914, she struck another pier before she was finally retired and scrapped in 1965, ending her 66-year-long career. On November 25, 1120, during a voyage from France to England, La Blanche Nef, or the White Ship, a ship that transported many nobles, including William Adelin, son of King Henry I of England, collided with a submerged rock, quickly capsized, and sank, killing all 300 people on board, except for a butcher from the city of Rouen, France, named Berold, who only managed to survive by clinging to the rock. According to chronicles from that time, passengers and crew were excessively drinking wine supplied by William prior to the ship's departure. As a result of the sinking and the death of William, who was the only male heir to the throne of England, as well as the subsequent death of his father Henry I in 1135, a civil war known in history as the Anarchy broke out in England, where rival factions vying for the throne fought each other, including Matilda, William's sister, and Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, who seized power in the same year and reigned until 1154, thus ending the anarchy. The MV Joyita was a small merchant vessel built in 1931 as a luxury yacht that was later repurposed for commercial use, including transporting cargo and passengers around the Pacific. On October 3rd, 1955, the ship set sail from Apia, Samoa for the Tokelau Islands, with 25 passengers and crew on board. However, the vessel never arrived at its destination, thus prompting a search and rescue operation on October 6th. After weeks of searching, the Joyita was discovered on November 10th, drifting more than 600 miles from its intended course in the South Pacific. The ship was found listing to its port side in a severely damaged state, with no sign of the passengers or crew, all of whom had seemingly mysteriously vanished. There were also many perplexing details about the ship's condition. It was partially flooded, but remained afloat. Its lifeboats and logbook were missing, and the engines were found to be inoperable. In addition, a doctor's bag containing a stethoscope, a scalpel, and 4 lengths of blood-stained bandages were also found. Despite extensive investigations, the fate of both the crew and the passengers remains unknown to this day, which led to numerous theories being proposed, ranging from mutiny and piracy to a fatal mishap and insurance fraud, to the crew even having been killed or kidnapped by either the Japanese or the Soviets. After its discovery, the Joyita was sold and eventually ran aground in 1959 in Vatuvalu, and by the 1970s, the ship essentially disintegrated due to material excavation from the locals. The SS Princess Sophia was a Canadian passenger liner launched in 1911 and owned by the Canadian Pacific Railway. On October 23, 1918, the ship departed from Skagway, Alaska for Vancouver, British Columbia, with around 350 passengers and crew aboard, most of whom were prospectors, miners, and their families returning from Alaska's gold fields. During the voyage, the ship encountered a severe snowstorm and was driven off course, eventually striking Vanderbilt Reef in the Lynn Canal. Initially, the ship remained stuck on the reef, and the crew decided to wait for rescue rather than attempt an evacuation in the dangerous weather. Several ships arrived to assist, such as the US LHT Cedar and the King and Wing, but weather conditions worsened, making rescue efforts impossible. For 2 days, the Princess Sophia remained stuck on the reef. However, in the evening of October 25th, the ship was suddenly dislodged from the reef by the storm and began to sink. Tragically, all 343 people on board perished as the vessel was swallowed by the rough seas. The only survivor was a dog. It is now commonly understood that the Princess Sophia's captain's decision to not abandon the ship and wait for rescue was a grave mistake. The Andrea Gale was a fishing vessel based out of Gloucester, Massachusetts, that was built in 1978. On September 20th, 1991, the boat and her 6-man crew, headed by Captain Frank W. Billy Tyne, departed from Gloucester to fish near the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. Unfortunately, during her return, the boat sailed right into the so-called perfect storm of October 1991, a combination of a nor'easter, remnants of Hurricane Grace, and a cold front. This created a massive storm with towering waves and hurricane-force winds. The last communication from the Andrea Gale was on October 28th, when Captain Tyne reported severe weather conditions. Shortly thereafter, the vessel disappeared without a trace. Despite extensive search efforts by the US Coast Guard, the boat was never found, and all 6 crew members were presumed lost at sea. The story later formed the basis for the 1997 book The Perfect Storm by Sebastian Junger, which was later famously adapted into a film in the year 2000, directed by Wolfgang Petersen, who later directed another ship-based film, 2006's Poseidon. The Kronan, also known as the Stora Kronan, meaning the Great Crown, was a Swedish warship and one of the largest naval vessels of its time, as she was equipped with over 100 cannons and could carry a crew of around 850 men. Built in 1672, it was part of Sweden's attempt to strengthen its naval dominance during the Second Northern War against Denmark and its allies. On June 1st, 1676, during the Battle of Öland in the Baltic Sea, the Kronan, while maneuvering against a combined Danish-Dutch fleet, attempted to make a sharp turn under too much sail, which caused it to capsize. As it tipped over, the gunpowder in the forward magazine ignited, leading to a massive explosion that tore the ship apart. The explosion and subsequent quick sinking killed around 800 of the crew, including Admiral Lorenz Kreutz, who was commanding the Swedish fleet from aboard the ship. The loss of the Kronan was a severe blow to the Swedish Navy and contributed to Sweden's defeat in the battle. The wreck of the Kronan was later discovered in 1980 by amateur researcher Anders Franzen, and subsequent underwater archaeological excavations have salvaged more than 30,000 artifacts, including cannons, coins, and personal items from the crew. The Mary Rose was a warship and one of the largest ships of the English Tudor Navy, commissioned by King Henry VIII in 1511, that served for 34 years in several conflicts, particularly against France, Scotland, and Brittany. On July 19, 1545, during the so-called Battle of the Solent against the French off the coast of Portsmouth, the Mary Rose suddenly capsized and sank while maneuvering to engage the enemy. The exact cause of the disaster remains a subject of debate, but many historians believe that the ship may have rolled over due to a combination of sudden strong winds, poor balance due to its heavy armament, as the ship carried around 90 guns, and open gun ports that allowed water to flood in. Of the estimated 400 to 500 crew members aboard, only 35 survived. The wreck of the Mary Rose was eventually discovered in 1971. 11 years later, the ship's remains and many artifacts were raised from the sea. Now having been preserved in good condition, they are now housed at the Mary Rose Museum in Portsmouth, which was opened in 1984. The SS Waratah was a British steamship built in 1908 and owned by the Blue Anchor Line that carried both passengers and cargo between Europe, South Africa, and Australia. On July 26, 1909, during her second ever voyage, the Waratah departed from Durban, South Africa, heading for Cape Town with 211 passengers and crew aboard. However, the ship mysteriously disappeared without sending any distress signals. Despite extensive search efforts over the following months, no trace of the ship, its passengers, or crew was ever found, and it remains an unsolved mystery to this day. Various theories have been proposed to explain the ship's disappearance, including the possibility that the ship's cargo shifted due to the rough seas, thus destabilizing the ship and causing it to capsize. Other theories suggest that it may have either been struck by a rogue wave or suffered some kind of explosion. Between 1983 and 2001, multiple search expeditions were launched to find the wreck, but none ever succeeded in locating it. The Waratah has since been referred to as the Titanic of the South, due to it having often been compared to the sinking of the Titanic, which happened 3 years later. The Great Lakes Storm of 1913, historically referred to as the Big Blow, the Freshwater Fury, and the White Hurricane, was a blizzard with hurricane-like winds that struck the Great Lakes region between the USA and Canada from November 7th to November 10th, 1913. It ended up becoming known as the deadliest and most destructive natural disaster to hit the Great Lakes in recorded history, as over 250 people were killed and a total of 38 ships were either destroyed or stranded. Most of them were Great Lakes freighters that carried loads of iron ore and coal that were also lost in the storm. The ships that were foundered during the storm include SS Isaac M. Scott with 28 victims, SS Charles S. Price with 28 victims, SS John A. McGean with 28 victims, SS Argus with 28 victims, SS Hydrus with 25 casualties, SS Henry B. Smith with 23 casualties, SS James Caruthers with 22 casualties, SS Regina with 20 casualties, SS Wexford with 20 lives lost, SS Learfield with 18 lives lost, SS Plymouth with 7 lives lost, and the lightship LV-82 Buffalo with 6 lives lost. All of these ships' wrecks were eventually discovered except for the Buffalo, which was raised a year later, recommissioned, and then scrapped in 1936. The MTS Oceanos was a French-built, Greek-owned cruise ship built in 1953 as the Jean Laborde. It was later sold to Epirotiki Lines in 1976 and renamed Oceanos. On August 3, 1991, she left the port of East London, South Africa for Durban, South Africa, with 581 people on board, but began encountering rough seas as the evening progressed. It is believed that during the late evening, the shell plating of a ventilation pipe that ran through the watertight aft bulkhead burst open due to freak waves slamming against the ship. This pipe was intended to be repaired prior to the ship's departure, but simply wasn't. The engine room then started filling with water, which caused an explosion that took the ship's power. The vessel began slowly rolling to its starboard side as passengers and crew began evacuating the ship with lifeboats. Because the ship's captain, Yannis Avranas, and his crew abandoned the ship early, the evacuation efforts were coordinated by Moss Hills, who worked as an entertainer aboard the ship. As morning struck, rescue helicopters arrived to find the Oceanos heavily listing. The list prevented the launching of the remaining lifeboats, so many passengers were still stuck on deck, but managed to be airlifted to safety. Miraculously, all 581 passengers and crew were able to be saved, while the ship capsized and sank bow first, with the sinking itself having been filmed and broadcast live on ABC News. After the sinking, Captain Avranas and 5 other officers were convicted of negligence for abandoning the ship early without helping passengers. The wreck of the Oceanos was later found at a depth of 92 to 97 meters, or 302 to 318 feet. The MV Goya was a Norwegian-built motor freighter launched in 1940 that was seized by the Nazi German Navy after the country's invasion of Norway that year and forcefully turned into a troop ship. During Operation Hannibal, the ship helped with evacuating German citizens and military personnel from around the Baltic Sea. That was until April 16, 1945, when the ship, during a voyage from Hell, Poland to Kiel, Germany, while carrying over 7,000 evacuees, far more than the ship's capacity of 850, was spotted by the Soviet submarine L-3 and torpedoed 4 times at exactly 4 minutes before midnight. Upon the torpedoes' impact, the ship immediately started burning, then split in 2 and sank, all in less than 4 minutes, with many people dying in their sleep. The exact death toll is disputed, but it's estimated to be anywhere between 6,000 and 7,200, while there are only between 172 to 183 survivors. thus making the sinking of the Goya one of the worst maritime disasters in history. The ship's wreck was later found in 2002 by Polish divers Grzegorz Dominik, Michał Porada, and Marek Jagodziński. It lies at a depth of 76 meters or 249 feet and was declared a war grave by the Polish Maritime Office. The K-141 Kursk was a Russian nuclear-powered submarine launched in 1994 and was one of the largest and most advanced submarines in the Russian Navy. During a major naval exercise on August 12, 2000, the Kursk became submerged when a catastrophic explosion occurred in the forward section of the submarine, officially caused by the failure of an HTP or high-test peroxide torpedo leaking fuel, followed by a second, much larger blast. The explosions blew a large hole in its hull that caused the Kursk to sink to the bottom of the Barents Sea, trapping all 118 crew members on board. During the first few days afterwards, Russian authorities downplayed the severity of the situation and declined rescue offers from other countries like the UK and Norway. But it later became clear that the submarine was lost, and all of its 118 crew members died. It was later revealed that at least 23 crew members had actually survived the initial explosions and were trapped in a compartment in the rear of the submarine, but despite rescue attempts, they eventually perished during the next few days due to lack of oxygen. In 2001, a year after the disaster, pieces of the wreck were raised from the seabed and recovered. The SS Atlantic was a transatlantic ocean liner owned by the White Star Line. Launched in 1870, it was the company's second ever steamship built after the launch of the Oceanic. In the early hours of April 1, 1873, during a voyage from Liverpool to New York, the ship ran aground in a storm near Halifax, Nova Scotia, at Meagher's Island, now known as Mars Island. Because the crew believed that they were short on coal and wouldn't make it to New York, they decided to do a stopover in Halifax for refueling. During this, however, the captain, James Williams, misjudged the ship's position while trying to reach the port of Halifax and thus struck the rocks, causing the ship to capsize and sink very quickly. Out of the 952 people aboard, over 550 perished, including all the women and all but one of the children, making it one of the deadliest maritime disasters of the 19th century. Many of the victims were later buried in a mass grave nearby. The sinking of the Atlantic caused major losses for the White Star Line, and in order to regain momentum, the company sold two of their ships, the SS Tropic and the SS Asiatic, though this wouldn't be the last time a White Star ship would sink. Finally, the wreck lies heavily fragmented at a depth of 40 to 60 feet or 12 to 18 meters. The RMS Lancastria, originally known as the RMS Torinia, was a British ocean liner originally launched in 1920 and operated by the Cunard Line. During World War II, the ship was requisitioned by the British government and was used as a troop ship. On June 17, 1940, the Lancastria was involved in Operation Ariel, the evacuation of British military personnel and civilians from France following Nazi Germany's takeover of the country. The ship, which carried between 6,000 and 9,000 people and was grossly overloaded, was anchored off the coast of Saint-Nazaire when it was suddenly attacked by German bombers. Bombs struck the Lancastria, causing it to capsize and sink in just 20 minutes. The sinking resulted in the loss of around 4,000 to 6,000 lives, making it one of the deadliest maritime disasters in British history. The British government, under Winston Churchill, initially placed a media blackout on the disaster to avoid damaging public morale during the critical period of the war.
The full extent of the tragedy only became widely known after the war already ended. The wreck of the Lancastria is currently inaccessible due to the French government having placed an exclusion zone around the site. On the evening of September 8, 1923, during a naval training exercise conducted by the US Navy, 7 destroyers accidentally ran aground at Honda Point near Santa Barbara, California, killing 23 sailors. Because radio navigation aids were still considered untrustworthy, the ships, which traveled in close formation, had relied on dead reckoning, which is estimating positions from their course and speed for navigation around the coastline, unaware that strong currents had pushed them off course towards the rocks, mistakenly believed to be the entrance to the Santa Barbara Channel. The ships that were lost were USS Delphi, the convoy's flagship, USS S.P. Lee, USS Young, USS Woodbury, USS Nicholas, USS Fuller, and USS Chauncey. In addition, 2 ships, USS Farragut and USS Somers, received slight damage but remained seaworthy, and 5 ships managed to avoid the rocks entirely. Following the disaster, the US government considered salvaging any of the wrecks to be too dangerous, instead selling them to a scrap merchant for a total of $1,035, which would be around $19,000 today, though by August 1929 they still remained at Honda Point. The Navy's court-martial board concluded that the disaster was the result of human error and faulty navigation. On the evening of July 19, 2018, a duck boat, which is a car that also functions as a boat, sank on Table Rock Lake near Branson, Missouri, killing 17 of its 31 passengers and crew, 5 of whom were children and 9 of whom were members of a single family from Indianapolis. Prior to the accident, the National Weather Service issued a severe thunderstorm warning with winds up to 60 miles per hour or 97 kilometers per hour and 3-foot waves for the area around the lake. Despite this, the 74-year-old boat, also known as Stretch Duck 7, set out into the lake. It remains unknown if the crew aboard the boat was even aware of the warning in the first place. Later investigations by the NTSB found that the loss of life was caused by both the boat's overhead canopies, trapping passengers inside, and the crew's decision to not hand out life jackets as they thought they wouldn't need them. After the accident, Kenneth Scott McGee, the boat's captain, Curtis P. Lenham, the manager of Ride the Ducks, the company that owned and operated the boat, and Charles V. Baltzel, the operations supervisor, were charged with 17 counts of first-degree involuntary manslaughter. However, their charges were later dropped because there was no evidence that they were aware of the storm's gust front and that the boat's unique characteristics were what led to the sinking. A number of lawsuits were also filed against Ride the Ducks that have since been settled. The HMS Birkenhead was a British troop ship launched in 1845, originally built as a steam frigate for the Royal Navy. In the early hours of February 26, 1852, the Birkenhead was transporting nearly 643 people, including British soldiers, their families, and crew, to Algoa Bay, South Africa, when it struck an uncharted rock near Danger Point off the coast of Gansbaai, South Africa. The collision tore a large hole in the ship's hull, causing it to sink rapidly. Because there weren't enough lifeboats to accommodate everyone on board, the soldiers were ordered to stand fast and allow the women and children to be evacuated first. The soldiers stood in ranks on deck as the ship went down to ensure that there was no panic or rush for the lifeboats. Tragically, only 193 people survived, most of the women and children, while over 450 men, including soldiers and crew, drowned or were killed by sharks in the waters. The incident gave rise to the unofficial Women and Children First protocol when abandoning ship, and also became the namesake of the Birkenhead drill, a term used to describe courage in the face of hopeless circumstances. The wreck lies at a shallow depth of 30 meters or 98 feet and was also rumored to contain around 3 tons of gold, causing it to become a popular target of treasure divers. Typhoon Cobra, also known as Halsey's Typhoon, was a powerful tropical cyclone that struck the Pacific Ocean near the Philippines, where the United States Pacific Fleet was stationed between December 14th and December 19th, 1944, during World War II. It caused the sinking of 3 destroyers, USS Hull, USS Monaghan, and USS Spence, with a combined death toll of 790 sailors, while 9 other warships were damaged and dozens of aircraft were swept overboard from aircraft carriers. Admiral William Halsey Jr., who commanded the fleet, was given false information about the typhoon and decided to have the ships remain on station despite early warning signs of worsening weather conditions. The later Court of Inquiry found that although Halsey had committed an error of judgment in sailing the Third Fleet into the heart of the typhoon, it stopped short of unambiguously recommending sanction. He was then promoted to Fleet Admiral in December 1945, and by March 1947 he went into retirement, later dying in 1959 from a heart attack, aged 76. The USS Thresher was a nuclear-powered submarine of the US Navy that was commissioned in 1961. On the morning of April 10, 1963, Thresher sank uncontrollably during a deep diving test about 350 kilometers or 220 miles off the coast of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, killing all 129 crew members aboard. It was later determined by the U.S. Navy Court of Inquiry that Thresher sank due to the failure of a seawater piping joint that allowed water to flood the engine room and cut electrical power, causing it to implode under intense underwater pressure. The wreckage was later found at a depth of 8,400 feet or 2,500 kilometers below sea level. The sinking later led to the creation of the Submarine Safety Program, or SubSafe for short, which was designed to maintain the safety of the Navy submarine fleet. Since its creation in 1963, only 1 submarine was lost, which is the topic of the next and our second-to-last entry. The USS Scorpion was another nuclear-powered submarine in the US Navy, commissioned in 1960, that was used during the Cold War to track down Soviet submarines. On May 22, 1968, while returning from the Mediterranean Sea to Norfolk, Virginia, the submarine, including all of its 99 crew members, disappeared in the Atlantic and was presumed sunk, becoming the only other nuclear submarine the US Navy has lost besides the previously mentioned Thresher. After a lengthy search operation, the wreck was found later that year in October at a depth of 9,800 feet or around 3,000 kilometers, about 400 miles southwest of the Azorian Islands. To this day, the cause of the sinking remains a subject of debate, though various theories have been proposed, including an accidental explosion, mechanical failure, or even a possible Soviet attack, though the latter lacks solid evidence. The US Navy's official investigation concluded that the most likely cause was a torpedo malfunction, though many have questioned this hypothesis.
So, the Fastnet Race is an offshore yacht race organized by the British Royal Ocean Racing Club that has been held for every 2 years since 1925. The 608 nautical mile long race itself begins in Cowes, England, through the English Channel and the Celtic Sea, then goes around Fastnet Rock in Ireland, where the race gets its name from, and ends in Plymouth. The 28th iteration of the race began on August 11th, 1979, with 303 participating yachts, and ended almost 4 days later with the winner being the famous media businessman Ted Turner, founder of CNN and TBS, and his yacht named Tenacious. However, the race itself became overshadowed by the tragic loss of 15 sailors and the capsizing of 75 boats, as the race and its participants were caught in a severe windstorm with hurricane-force winds of up to 70 knots or 80 miles per hour and 40-foot waves only 2 days after the race started. The tragedy not only led to the largest ever emergency rescue operation in peacetime history, in which around 4,000 people from the British and Irish navies were involved, but also became known as the worst sailing disaster in history and led to re-evaluations of safety standards in ocean racing, particularly in regards to the life rafts, which were only intended for calm waters and repeatedly capsized in the storm, thus contributing to the deaths of sailors.
Finally, for Tier 3, we have the USS West Virginia, an American battleship launched in 1921. During the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the ship, which happened to be docked there, was severely damaged by Japanese torpedoes and bombs, causing it to catch on fire and sink to the bottom of the harbor on an even keel, causing the deaths of 106 men. Among them were 3 sailors, Ronald Endicott, Clifford Olds, and Lewis Costin, who became trapped in an airtight storeroom inside the wreck and had to endure 16 days in darkness while resorting to screaming and banging on the walls of the room to call attention to themselves. Unfortunately, during the later salvage operations, they were found dead, becoming the last victims of the Pearl Harbor attacks. Finally, the West Virginia itself was raised and recommissioned until 1959, when it was sold for scrap.